Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this is based on climate change refugees, and we have our world famous speaker, Professor David Smith from USA, and we have our world famous foundation's owner, Mr. James Eid, who is actually running his foundation around the world. So I want to discuss with first Professor David Smith. Climate change refugee is a major problem right now. Even it's increasing. So what's your analysis? What type of strategy we can implement? And already many of the think tank, they're observing our show and they're really happy how you and our speakers actually give different kind of analysis on different topic. So Professor David Smith, how do you want to analyze to this topic?
Well, it again is a topic that has interactions with many other different parts of the whole equation. As you look at climate change, how the pieces fit together. One of the challenges with this one is the climate change is really a byproduct of climate change. It's really a byproduct of the regulatory actions that are taken to do things and the impact of those sometimes totally unconsequential. One of the things I've seen in Texas, we've seen in California, United States, we've seen other places, is we were doing things that we thought were good for the environment, good for climate change, but yet when, for example, a fire starts, it has consequences that affect the other inhabitants, the other things around that activity. Not far from my house here in Austin, we had a situation where they decided they were not going to clear any underbrush. They were not going to do any of those types of works on it. And there was a lightning strike, and it destroyed hundreds of homes because of the impacts we thought we were working with on climate change had those type of consequential steps that were not thought of when the regulations and the government actions were taken. And you see that many different places. In the United States, it's particularly bad in California and up in the northwest parts of the northern continent here. It to me is another example how you need to look at the ecosystem that's in place when you begin to talk about climate change, when you begin to look at the impacts of governmental actions, individual actions, corporate actions. They all will have an impact, and you have to look at the whole consequences of your actions and the whole ecosystem to really understand them well. It's both good and bad. I mean, if I take the whole environment around the climate change emphasis and put it in another context like science and apply it to the discovery process there. Many of the great discoveries have been made because of unthought of actions and unthought of consequences. And I think we're seeing it. It goes with being human. It goes with our thought process being such that we want to try things even though we don't know what the answers will be. We want to try things even though we don't really understand what the consequences are. And I think that's the situation that we're in here. And it's one that we need to understand better. And I think the work around it will help that. But I think that's my first comments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor David Smith. My friend, Mr. James Eid, how do you want to analyze this climate change and refugee is a big issue? We have our expert panelist, Professor Viva. She is also world famous speakers. So we will learn more about climate change and climate change refugee related things. So Mr. James Eid, how do you want to analyze today's topic?
Well, I would be happy to defer to Viva unless she wants to listen to me first.
I'll listen to you first.
All right. The main thing that I want to say is these are complicated problems. And as Professor David said, you know, we have unintended consequences even with the best of intentions. So it's not you know, for our benefit to play the blame game and point fingers and say, you said it would be like this, but now we find out it's like that. It's just that it's such a complicated question. The idea of tackling it is going to be a certain amount of trial and error. You try something and you get feedback that says, oops, we better try something else. And that's the process of learning. So we have to accept that we don't understand all of the consequences, and the best of intentions, people with the brightest minds, the best of intentions will make mistakes. You have to go in there accepting that as just a fact of life. And it's such a complicated problem that we can use statistics to give us a false sense of precision. For example, we can say, well, climate change, and people talk about climate warming. Well, there's only been a 1% increase. But you know, the difference in climate change is catastrophic differences in local weather patterns. And what we are seeing, for example, I'll pick on Professor David's state, Texas. You know, Texas power systems failed because of heat, the intensity of the heat for a short period of time. And it failed because it got so cold. And then, it, you know, unintended and unconceivable cold in Texas. And then it was a you can blame game, lack of preparation, but you know, you just didn't see it coming. You weren't prepared. And there may have been some policy disastrous decisions behind it all, but who cares? The fact is that these wild swings in temperature, and if you average them, you might say, well, there's only an overall 1% increase in temperature. So, you know, but that's missing the point. We have these extremes that we never experienced before in the Pacific Northwest because of the patterns of climate change in the Arctic and the polar regions and what's going on in subtropical parts of the globe. You know, we have these impacts on the jet stream, which means that when the heat wave hits, it stays in the Pacific Northwest. When it didn't, it just kept moving. And so these are unintended, unanticipated consequences of a global problem, a global climate change. So if you want to look at your I'll stay silent while you look at your pictures.
Okay, basically there is a research informations like Refugee Research Coalitions. Professor David Smith, this is very, very important because there are many interesting data which is really relevant for this today's discussions on climate change and climate change refugee for our audience, because we have many audience from university, especially from research industry. I think this will be helpful for them. Even I think around 100 different researcher from masters and PhD level, they are also start working with World Talent Economy Forum. I think this kind of reference is very important for them. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sharif. And I just wanted to say, and what this happens with these climate extremes and these devastating weather pattern changes can lead to catastrophic consequences, which makes formerly inhabitable land uninhabitable. And this tends to drive people to other locations. But we have these boundaries between us that keep us apart. And so when you try to leave this place that used to have water and now you don't, you've got to go someplace that has water, and people don't want you there because they want to keep their own water. So this leads to unintended consequences, including conflicts that we weren't expecting. And this is the problem that we're having with a very complicated subject that our initial reactions are sometimes inadequate to the problem, and we have to adjust. We have to keep adjusting. So we must be nimble and quick in our adjustments and be open to change, because change is slapping us in the face. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Jamsit. We have our world famous speakers as well as a climate change activist, Professor Viva. So Professor, how do you want to analyze, and especially if you can give us some deep understanding about this refugee and what should we do, what type of strategy different kind of countries from Asia they can take for these refugees.
Well, I think we're going to have to learn how to share a little bit more. And sadly enough, I was watching, I picked up a Facebook link a couple of days ago into the heartland of the United States with some right-wing news people that were watching buses come over the border from Mexico in McAllen, Texas. And in McAllen, Texas, there is now a pipeline of refugees that are coming over that are properly being bused. Some of the children that don't have parents, but are being allowed in because they're being, I guess they've been sent by their parents ahead of possibly the parents coming. Some of their stories are a little bit up in the air, but the right-wing reporters were really concerned because they supported the building of Trump's wall. Okay, so it is an ongoing thing where you can watch that nationalism sort of take hold of the paranoia of climate refugees, and it is fomenting a little bit in the United States because the nationalists really believe that they are legal and illegal and undocumented and unjustified. They're not tying it to the climate disaster because they basically think climate change is a hoax. So it's a fairly complicated problem of perception in some quarters in our world, and they weren't stopping the people coming, but they felt that they were going to be reporting it to Trump's group, and there's a suggestion that he's not out of the presidential game at all. So it's going to be an ongoing saga for the refugees coming over. And there were quite a few buses in the 20-minute video feed that I saw there. There were 4 of them. So there is a significant action by President Biden, I believe, to allow them in. So it is very polarized, and the United States is an excellent example of this political polarization that's happening. So we have to find our center on this, and sort of deal with the climate change denial, nationalist, people that don't want more people in the country, because all the developed countries sort of owe this now to the people who are losing their home and livelihood. We owe this, even if it's just temporary. If there was a fix, these people would want to go back if they could. So it's a pretty thorny issue, but I think that reason is going to have the upper hand, where people are just going to say, wait a minute, we can accommodate this. And we just have to change our mindset a little bit. And another thing that's been pointed out is that people move around on Earth and have been migrating for ever since we can remember. So the whole phenomena of migration is just going to be caused by climate change now rather than other causes nearly as much. So, the other front to be working on is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I'll just leave that as my introductory remarks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor. Professor David Smith, policy is major important issue. Even Professor Viva always discuss on that point. Even in Asia Pacific, we are trying to integrate it with the policy and other things. So refugee is the biggest problem, and many country has this kind of problem. Example, Bangladesh has many refugees from Myanmar. Even Malaysia, they have also many refugees from Myanmar and other countries. So what is the solutions? Like, who gonna take responsibility, this huge amount of people, how we can work, how we can solve, what are the strategy we can take?
Well, this is a really complicated issue because on one hand, we do have the climate change, which is causing this. You do have the unintended consequences that happen from the climate change. And then you have varying governmental responses, governmental policy ones. I mean, I have seen firsthand what she was talking about down at the border of Texas. And I've actually seen its impact up here in Austin and in Dallas, where I live, both places. And it really is a complicated issue because I can tell you in Texas, the number of refugees we have crossing the border have created tremendous economic crisis. The healthcare system, particularly along the border, is totally overwhelmed. It was not designed to accommodate that many people, not only receiving the healthcare benefits, but receiving them for free.
Mhm.
And I can tell you here, our systems just cannot accommodate it. In Austin, until recently, Austin was a homeless sanctuary city, and our crime rate went up over 400%. Parts of Austin, I can tell you, I will no longer visit because the homelessness there, primarily of people coming across the border, is so severe that you are attacked walking down the street. And so it's one of those systems again where we have to work at it within the whole. Do I feel compassionate for the people? Yes, but we also need to understand it's a balancing act, and it's a really fine balancing act. And I think that is, in response to your questions, the government needs to work to understand that. It's kind of like filling a glass with water. When you reach the top of the glass, it overflows and it goes and does things you don't know where it's going to go and what it's going to do. I think this whole emphasis of the climate change refugee is like filling that glass of water to overflowing. And you either need to figure out a way to get a bigger glass or deal with the unintended consequences of it overflowing around you. And again, it goes back to what I said the first time. I really think you have to look at the full scope of it and not just an isolated part of it.
Mhm. Thank you. Mr. Jamsit.
Thank you, Sharif. I didn't finish taking notes, but I want to double down on something that Professor Livio touched upon. There's a rise of nationalism, and this is not just in the United States. This is across most of the world. Nationalism is not the answer. This is a complicated question, and nationalism is really based on fear, and people are afraid, and justifiably so. There's a lot to be afraid of, but you never make your best decisions out of fear. So what you have to do is be calm and reasoned in your approach. And this is not easy. This is another delicate balance that people must have, and I say start with yourself. Don't be afraid. And don't play the blame game, get angry at somebody, get angry at the people that are coming because they have no water, they want to drink water that you think you own. So don't get angry at them. You don't make optimal decisions based on anger. Fear and anger should not be driving us. And what should be driving us is the solutions, the intellectual interest in providing solutions to problems. If there's a problem, right behind it is trailing a solution. We just have to be curious enough and open enough to find it. And so these things are incredibly complicated, so there's no easy answer. There's no saying, well, just turn off the lights earlier than you used to. That won't solve the problem. It's not a simple thing. And some of the things that we try will be mistaken, and we will have to try again and again. So we need to have perseverance and discipline in our approaches, and take the feedback that we get and adapt to the feedback we get and try something new. And so change is also fear-based. People don't like change, but we are changing. We're getting slapped in the face with change, and we must look at it squarely in the eye, without fear, without anger, with just our intelligence, and I'm not trying to change people's minds as much as I'm trying to change people's hearts, with compassion as well. We have to look at these and come up with compassionate solutions. And we can't rely on free market capitalism. Some of this economic systems is also part of the discussion, as well as the policy decisions. That's why these are complicated things. Free market capitalism isn't going to support that healthcare structure that was overwhelmed in southern Texas, on the borders of Texas. The free market, you can't rely on them to solve it. This is a governmental policy decision that you have to have. So obviously, free market capitalism, you have to use appropriate technology. Use it where it's appropriate, and don't rely on it where it doesn't work. It's like building a windmill where there's no wind. So these are the things that we have to be able to adjust to. We have a capitalist-minded system, but it isn't a solution for everything. So sometimes the government has to step up where it's appropriate. And when your healthcare system is broken, it may not be the free market capitalists that solve it. It may be a governmental solution, it may be a policy solution, it may be a combination of all three. So these are the things that we have to be open to, changing the way we look at these problems if we have any hope of solving them. We can't rely on the past, always looking at the past for our solutions for the future, for the present. We have to change, and we have to change yesterday, but it's too late about yesterday, so change today. Be open to change today, and take the appropriate actions. And when you think you're making the appropriate adjustment, and the feedback from the environment is, no, that's not appropriate, be open to changing that. Changing you have to be nimble, you have to be quick, because these problems that we're talking about that are very complicated are also catastrophic in nature. You have to have compassion for people that are coming because there's no longer any drinking water where they used to live. So don't blame them, and don't blame the policy of the previous administration for it. Just accept what's really happening, and don't rely on the false precision of data. Oh, the climate is only 1% hotter. No, man, look at what's going on in reality. Because we can use data to create information, or we can use data to give us a false sense of precision and then denies reality. It says, hey, climate really isn't, we don't have climate warming, it's only going up 1%. That's not reality-based. Reality is Texas energy systems failed because of cold weather, and it failed because of hot weather. These are extremes that they hadn't experienced before. That's reality. So what's going on in the Pacific Northwest with the heat wave that is just unimaginably hot for people who live in Seattle. I visited Seattle. It's a wonderful city, but it's usually raining. They're not used to this. These are new things, new experiences. So we have to be willing to look at reality, what's really going on. And this rise of nationalism must be resisted, because that's fear-based. We're just afraid. And we can't solve these problems out of fear. Thanks again, Sharif. Great topic.
Thank you. Professor Viva. From our audience, we are observing he's from Sri Lanka. He's just discussing about some of the initiative of United Nations, and he want to give them more thanks. And beside that, every country is because of refugee, maybe his point is like that. If you see, sir, more crimes also made by these categories as well. So what do you think in terms of making these refugees and other people's more disciplines and more polite for adjust with the communities or the culture? What is your advice?
Well, I would ask them openly, publicly from where I am right now, to be as cooperative as possible with the authorities that are helping them. And I suspect that sometimes the right-wing extremism provokes some of the criminal behavior. I think there's actually some friction between that group and if they get access to refugee populations, there may be, it's potential anyway, there's potential for that, especially given the January 6th insurrectional stuff that happened in the States. But I think that one of the things that's going to happen is people are going to learn more about the environment being changed, sometimes up to 100-fold. For example, just the temperature is one of the moderate things that changes on the scale of response to all these greenhouse gases. The hydroxyl radical is overwhelmed. It's a natural compound in the atmosphere, but it has been, by our pollution collectively, overwhelmed by 100-fold. Okay, so having had that run for a couple of decades now on the atmosphere, we're now seeing some other exponential changes like ice melting and temperature increase, and also the leakage of methane coming now. So these exponential markers that we have indicate that other areas are going to really have unfortunate, difficult breakthroughs. And these pressures and the pressure of refugees is going to probably be the one that forces policy change, like, for example, in the United States, taxing the wealthy. It'll probably bring that out to the forefront so that the governments that are looking for money for health infrastructure can source some new funds. They will be backtracking probably to the wealthy, which is probably a good idea. We've seen a huge disparity between the middle class and the average basic wage. Before you place any refugee into the situation, there is already a lack of fairness in the U.S. system, tax system. And I think that the pressures are going to actually force us everywhere, but probably make that situation better under a lot of pressure, just so that the U.S. can keep going either at the state or federal level. So that's where I would leave that. The crime, we just have to make sure that, just like under any crisis, we keep people that don't agree apart. Just like, a domestic dispute, you separate the two members of the domestic dispute. You need to have separation. It is an emergency. It is a situation where a lot of people feel out of control and would like to have more control. You have to actually have authority in there keeping it separate. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, if you have any suggestion and advice on that point.
I really wish I did. The problem is a complicated problem. You see it isolated in different parts, and that's almost my suggestion, is begin to look at some of the elements, work them, because the climate change refugee affects wildlife. It affects grasslands and food and crops. It affects water and water distribution, as has been discussed. It affects communities. It affects social services and all the other elements of that. When we talk about it in the relationship of those all together, there is consequences for most of the decisions that impact the other ones there. And it's taking those and putting them in the context. This is an area where In a perfect world, the decisions would be made without political concern. The decisions could be made without saying it's a left wing or right wing type of decision. And because the reality is it's a decision that affects the region. It's a decision that affects the global community, and there is not a consensus on how to do it, on whether you're a centralist, left or right leaning on the different places. And like many decisions, there's good and bad on each of those views. And so it's really working through and trying to find the most logical approach that goes to some of the scientific, medical terms as you begin to go through. I love the term in those that says, do not do harm. And if we can approach a way where we can follow the edict of try to not do harm, I think that is one of the goals as we can work through this really very, very, very complicated, very polarizing issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Jamsit.
Thank you, Sharif. Yes, it is a very complicated subject, and I'm not going to pretend that I have answers. However, I will say that what we have often been taught is to pursue our rational self-interest, and if everyone does that, then everything will be fine. Well, this is magical thinking, because rational self-interest and the pursuit of it tends to lead towards selfishness, towards consuming, getting more and more and more, and not based on what you need, based on what you want. So we have to change our thinking. Start with yourself. Don't be so desperate to keep up with the Joneses. Don't be so desperate to get the newest, the latest, greatest invention and to show it to your neighbor and say, see what I have. This is not rational thinking. This is selfish thinking. So what we want to pursue is enlightened self-interest. And enlightened self-interest includes others. And it looks at others the way you would want to treat others, the way you would want them to treat you. This is more enlightened. And so if someone has no water and you do, share it. Why wouldn't you? If you're pursuing your enlightened self-interest. But if you're pursuing only your narrow self-interest, you're just going to say, I have water, it's mine. You can't have it. Then they're going to say, well, I'm going to die if I don't get it. And they will come after you. And there will be a rise in crime, a rise in conflict, because you have what they need. It's not so much what they want, it's what they need. Because we all need food, we all need water, and we all need shelter from the storm. And if you have the resources, why on earth would you share them? So I say, ask not what the planet can do for you, but what you can do for the planet. Change yourself first. Start thinking of others besides yourself. Thinking of others' interests besides yourself will actually, funny enough, make you feel better about yourself. It seems funny, but it actually works that way. When you're just pursuing and consuming and wanting more and more, you're never going to be satisfied. But if you reach out and help and share, you will find satisfaction that you only dreamed about. When you make others who did not have shelter from the storm, did not have food, did not have water, when you give them those things that everyone needs, you feel better about yourself. And if your country is doing that, you feel better about your country. But if your country is hoarding others, if you're saying America first, you're saying America alone. You're not thinking of others. And so you're thinking of only your own country. So this is not the way to solve these problems. I can't tell you what the answer is, but I can tell you what doesn't work. What doesn't work is the pursuit of narrow, selfish interest and thinking in terms of your own borders. And as long as we're safe, who cares about the rest of the world? No, we're all in this together. So that's not going to work. I can tell you that. But I can't tell you exactly how we're going to solve it, but I can tell you how we can start to solve it is by enlightened self-interest, which we think of people as our brothers and sisters. We think of them as our family, one world, one family. And we think in those terms, then we care about our family members, or most of us do. So think about, I care about people that don't eat in Africa, have no food in Africa. So what my foundation does sometimes is help. But you know, one person doesn't make a difference. But what if there was 1 million people doing it? That might make a little bit of a difference, wouldn't it? So, you know, to change your attitude so you're not just focused on yourself and consuming more, getting yourself to be higher up in the hierarchy of society. This is mindless thinking, and it's never ending in satisfaction, and it'll never solve our problems. So we have to change ourselves first. Those in our sphere of influence can change, and then they can change those who are in their sphere of influence, and it may keep growing. Who knows? But I hope it does. And at the pace of this change, this enlightened self-interest instead of narrow self-interest, will it be fast enough to keep up with what is catastrophic? The future is an emergency. The present, we're seeing it all around us. The weather patterns have changed because of climate change. So we're seeing disastrous consequences. We had a condo that collapsed and they tore it down because they didn't think the rest of it was going to be able to survive the next hurricane. Because guess what? Hurricanes are more frequent and more violent. Why? No, well, this may happen every 500 years, we say. No, man, this is happening because of man. Mankind has made these changes. We've accelerated the pace of change. You know, these are not 1 in every 500 years kinds of occurrences. These are happening more frequently, more disastrously than ever before, because we've changed the climate. We've polluted it. We've done a disastrous job of being stewards of our environment. So we have to change. Thank you, Sharif.
Thank you, Professor Viba. Is there any legal status, because our youth community, they love to learn more, for this climate change refugee? Is there any law, rules, and regulations from UN or any other country they can, yes, to protect these climate change refugees?
Yeah, there's actually a commission from the United Nations called the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And they are now regularly wide open with their statement on whether or not food and water shortages are climate caused. I think a few scientists urged them, including myself, to make that note in the different situations, such as Sudan or Ethiopia or wherever they are, that it is tied to climate change, because they think that statistic needs to be ingrained in the mainstream news as much as possible. And so that commission has a whole body of legislation which governs it. And so, you know, you see the bags of food and the consistent packaging for water bottles and stuff. They have scaled up, you know, some infrastructure through the UNHCR. And, you know, there's also the World Health Organization, WHO, who does statistics. They're really good on air quality as well, too, just fantastic. And there are other ones as well, too. So you can just type in World Emergency Programs or World Food Programs and search. And you can always find out if you feel that your money going to a large organization would be spent too much on its administration. You can always find something smaller and more agile to put your money into. So you just have to spend a little bit of time to look. So as far as law goes, there is international law around refugees, and there's international law for trade and commerce, but there's also international law around the Red Cross, okay, and a few other organizations like that, where they can invoke a clause that gives them carte blanche to go into an area and set up as much as possible. There are responses like that for the local response. I think probably that is not as thorny of an issue. The main issue with those is getting them fully funded. So this comes back to where's the money going to come from? Because essentially what's happened is a lot of large companies have foisted the climate disaster onto the taxpayer in countries where politicians already allocate a lot of money to climate mitigation and are moving with lots of policy. But this is what we have to stop. We have to stop by law, and it's coming, I believe, because they're being sued. We have to stop by law the foisting of the cleanup costs onto the taxpayer. It's not the taxpayer that is responsible. It is the seller of the goods that caused the carbon footprint. So, and in that realm, there is also another person who I would like to mention, who I think everybody should really watch and listen to. His name is Dr. David Anderson. He was the chief of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change in the UK. That's Anderson with S-O-N on the end of the name, Dr. Kevin Anderson. He is absolutely one of the best climate change presenters in the world. And he also is a strong leader in urging countries to focus on where the money is, where the money is and where it needs to flow. And it's not a bone to pick. We just know that the money is primarily with the wealthy class that has developed, and that they have had some privileges of low tax in some of our jurisdictions that has been counterproductive. And we know that because that's why we're seeing shortages now. Some of the shortage of infrastructure in Texas might be because they don't tax enough. Just a suggestion there, as a possibility. But really, the politicians will learn, I think, probably the hard way, that they are the defender of the taxpayer, and they have to step in between the taxpayer and the polluter in a much more aggressive way. And I have, as an individual, also called for all the wealthy people, people that are net worth over $3 to $5 million, to try and take their lives and their financial portfolios carbon negative as quickly as possible, because they are the high footprint problem that would, if they en masse changed what they were doing as quickly as possible, would have a massive impact on the global carbon footprint. And we need to call them to do this and come to the table to do this, because otherwise the taxpayer is going to suffer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor David Smith. What kind of scientific improvement happening? We discuss a lot, but I just want to share more information with our audience that for solving this climate change, especially you are expert also, your organization working for different developing nations. So how they can get benefit from modern science and technology?
Well, one of the ways you enact change is you enact change through education. And improving access to education that includes elements of this is very important. I can tell you, as we look at the school systems, there's not a lot taught that understands the full cycle of climate change and how it affects the other elements. It tends to be there a little bit more narrow. Also, you begin to see the differences. What you described in Texas with the energy challenge over the winter was really interesting because the vast majority of the Texas electrical grid is privately owned, not government owned, and taxpayer money does not impact the Texas grid.
Mhm.
The regulatory side does. And what was interesting is the regulatory part of this prior to the power grid going down asked federal permission to temporarily exceed part of the carbon footprint because so many of the natural resources were offline. Because Texas doesn't typically use a lot of electrical energy during the winter, our peak is the summer.
Mhm.
So during the winter is when maintenance is done. The federal government declined the request to temporarily use some natural gas generated and to use some oil generated resources to balance the load out, which caused the system to crash. Now, was that a taxpayer problem? No. The Texas system is primarily privately owned. Was it an administrative issue in Texas? Yes. But it was aggravated by a federal government decision to temporarily release a thing to keep the grid stable. That is a great example of a climate change decision that cost trillions of dollars, that cost loss of life, that impacted millions of people because of a bureaucratic decision that is there. So it gets back to what I said earlier, Sri, is oftentimes when you look at the climate change element of refugees, it doesn't make sense to look at it unless you look at it as a whole. And the Texas example is actually a very interesting one because, yes, the statewide board that manages the Texas grid should have done things differently when the request was to add capacity was turned down. And instead, they waited until it was a catastrophic failure.
Mhm.
You know, it takes days to bring up power plants.
Mhm.
You cannot just flip a switch
Yeah.
and add megawatts to the grid.
Mhm.
And again, it's us not understanding, and Sharif, you're going to smile at me with this one. It's not us understanding that today everything has become a systems of systems. Whether it's technology, whether it's climate change and the reactions to climate change, everything has become a systems of systems. And my greatest advice to developing nations is within your education systems. We need to begin to bring into context the concept of systems of systems. With our globally interconnected world, with the digitalization of most of our means of production, you have to understand a systems of systems approach because what happens in here will affect here, which will affect up here. And developing nations need to begin to bring that to their repertoire.
Thank you. Mr. James Heath.
Yes, it is system of systems. That's a great way of expressing this. That's why the unintended consequences are so pronounced in some ways. what happened in Texas was a catastrophe. And, the effects that we can talk about it in terms of numbers. That's just data. Think about the people that actually suffered. Think about that. Just for a moment, feel what they felt. And you would have more compassion for what they felt. But, this is we don't want to play the blame game. The federal government did this, the regulatory guys did that. Maybe the question is, should the Texas energy system have been privatized at all? We can all think about this, but what we're really saying is they're not working together. They aren't cooperating together to solve a complicated problem of making sure, and when it gets really cold, we have the resources to provide heat. And when it gets really hot, we have the resources to provide cooling. So these are the things. It takes cooperation, and it takes a new mindset, and to look at it as a system. And this is not our political strong suit. Our policies now, we have a senator can say, well, I'm going to not support your motion unless you support building a fighter jet that the Army doesn't need, or the military doesn't need in my state. And then my state likes me because we're providing money and jobs. And so they're going to reelect me, and I'm going to be concentrating on getting what the country doesn't need into my state to provide jobs, and I'm going to be considered to be popular. And so we have this non-systems approach to things built into our system. So, and this is the change that really needs to take place. We have to start to think about how we interrelate with one another, and that we're all part of the system, and take this systems approach. And there is extremists on both sides. It's not a left or right, liberal or radical, conservative, that type of thing. But these extremists get all the publicity. And when you tune into a source that you think is information, they're not trying to give you information. They're trying to persuade you to their way of thinking. So there's too much of this going on in our airwaves right now. It's very difficult to get adequate information, because what you're getting is somebody's point of view trying to persuade you to agree with their point of view. And built into this point of view is a lot of assumptions. But if you challenge the assumptions, they don't hold up to scrutiny. But you never get to that point. We argue past each other, and we never come to the table with the overall goal of cooperating in mind, because we're not really trained to cooperate, we're trained to compete. So this kind of mindset is what needs to be changed. I think so. If you want to adopt a system of systems approach, you have to change your mindset. Start with yourself first. Start being open to the experience of others. Maybe their experience is different from you. Maybe if you put me in a foreign country and gave me no shelter, no food, no water, I would be called a criminal. And I would take what I need from you, and the authorities would arrest me. And maybe the authorities would beat me with their batons. Maybe the authorities would turn fire hoses on me. So just by the grace of good fortune, that's not happening to me. But someone like me, maybe they don't look like me. Maybe their color of their skin's a little different. But maybe they're experiencing just what I would experience if I was in their shoes. So put yourself in other people's shoes, and think about their experience, which might be radically different from your own, and show compassion to them, and try to cooperate with them, and try to make sure that people can live lives of dignity. They have enough food, enough water, and shelter from the storm. And we can provide cooling in intense heat. We can provide heat in intense cold. So these are the types of things that we need to get our minds centered on solving these types of problems. It is not the right's fault. It's not the left's fault. It's not the immigrants' fault. It's the fact that we're thinking of our own narrow self-interest rather than our enlightened self-interest. Thanks again.
Thank you. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. I'm sure that Professor David has some meeting. So Professor Viva, what's your concluding remarks? Then Professor David, and finally Mr. James.
I guess Asia, Pacific, and also the rest of the people that are listening need to be looking at where are the contingency plans. There are some available through Health Canada, Emergency Preparedness Canada, and the same agencies in other countries. But it's always good to go and have a look at what they've got online for different disaster plans, and be familiar with your own local disaster, your municipal disaster plans. We just had a couple of fires in my city here this week. It was very hot. It was record heat, and it wasn't just 1 or 2 degrees. It was 7 degrees over the hottest it's ever been. So we are seeing a slightly exponential jump in what's going on with temperature here, and that's at the 60th parallel. So, you got to have things like the bug out bag ready. I know there's a really large prepping community in the United States. There's also a large prepper community in Canada as well. So once you have that in place, it's a little harder to, actually act out any racist tendencies, I think, with a person, because you have your own interests protected, and you're working from a platform where you can be a little bit more charitable with what else is available in your society. So I would say that, it's really good that often the prepper community says you're prepping for a few neighbors as well when you're collecting stuff for your situation. So let's all think about the contingency plans at the federal, provincial, state, and regional and local levels a little bit, while knowing that climate change really is coming down the pipeline in a big way.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks today?
Well, I agree with most of what we've said today, really, is that a view of handling this complex problem is one that we need to look at different ways to fund it. We need to look at different ways to regulate it. One of the very interesting things with climate change is if I make changes in Texas, that's not enough for the United States. If I make changes in Texas and the United States, that's not enough for the impacts in Canada and Mexico. If I make changes in those 4 regions, well, that's not enough unless I go make changes in China, and so forth. So it's one that we have to look with how to begin to do them, how we put them there. You see the United Nations making an effort in there, but where we will get more impact is if we begin to see many of the larger organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, others like that beginning to make commitments around this. You'll see more impact if we begin to get the top 1,000 universities to begin to look at how to address this problem. And again, from my perspective, begin to teach systems of systems, because it's there. And we need to understand that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And then for that reaction, there's another equal but opposite reaction. And this issue is one where that Einstein theory plays very well. And we don't understand all those interactions yet. So as we begin to do our activities around there, we have to go fast, slow. We have to solve the issues as rapidly as we can, but we need to understand what we're doing has the other impacts as well. And we really need to understand those as we move fast, slow. And I think that's my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Jamsit.
Well, Sharif, my concluding remarks always start with thanking you for assembling the panel and raising the topic. And I always learn something. I've been taking scrupulous notes that we've been talking to each other. I usually close with the idea that we've already built plenty of walls. We don't need more walls. We need to tear down the walls between us. Because if I have something that the people behind the wall need, food, water, shelter from the storms, they will come and take it from me. There will be conflict. Maybe I can protect myself, but I will have to kill others to keep them from getting what I have that they need. And so this conflict, the cost of conflict is catastrophic. It's enormous. It's unbelievably costly. So if you just take a pure economical approach to it, it's a lot easier to cooperate and to share. It's a lot more effective. It's a lot more efficient. It's a lot less costly than to hoard and to keep and to protect. So these are the things. Do not build walls, tear them down, build bridges so that we can walk across the bridges and be in each other's company and not think of them as the other, to be feared, to be hated, to be resisted, to be protected ourselves against. These are not the answers. I cannot tell you what the answer is, but I can tell you what's not working. It's not working to think of others as the enemy. We have to start thinking them as our friends, as our family. And when we start to think that way, we start to think about cooperation. Now, this sounds incredibly naive on my part to say this, because there are regimes out there, totalitarian regimes, that will use our words of cooperation as a sign of weakness and try to take advantage of us. So, of course, you have to protect yourselves against that. You don't go stumbling blindly and handing out money to everybody. No, of course not. Take adequate preparations. For just to keep yourself secure. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to build walls. That means what you can do is join alliances and work together. And if there's a lot of you and just a few of these totalitarian regimes that will try to exploit you, good luck to them. But if we're all just taking care of ourselves, man, their chances of winning go way up. So no, I'm anti-totalitarianism. I'm anti-fascism. And, I am also peace-loving. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You do not want authoritarian hierarchical structures in place. Only when appropriate. Some places that's definitely appropriate and can be useful to society in general. But if we want a just society, we can't have just a certain tiny percentage of the people having all the goods and the vast majority having too little to live lives of dignity. So social justice is primarily just, I want to live my life in a just way where I can hold my head high, look people in the eye. And I think if we all do that, if most of us do that, if the vast majority of us do that, this will be a better world for all. Thank you, Sharif. Thank you again for a wonderful show.
Thank you everyone for joining today's session. This session is actually very, very informative and very helpful for our community, especially from the Asia Pacific. And when we feel happy, let's say example, before the show, I get different calls from the different student community. They are PhD students and the master's level student. They are actually learning from our global discussion platforms. And I request everyone, because this is World Talent Economy Forum, it's a free, but fact is that we have to reach millions of people. This is the our demand. This is the reality that from modern science, modern engineering, modern technology, many student, youth communities, people, those who are the future, they are not connected yet. So we have to connect all of the people. So we are actually moving forward with our fundraising option. It's not that we have in great demand of money. We have to solve the problem, especially academic problem, what Professor Viva said, or Professor David said, or Mr. James said. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to develop a better ecosystem with the help of our heroes of the program, Professor Viva, Mr. James Seed, Professor David Smith, and everyone. So hopefully our initiative will be very much helpful for the ecosystem. We are trying to make a bridging in between developed nations and developing nations, and hopefully we can minimize the gap. Knowledge is everything. the more we have engaged with the knowledgeable people, we can learn more. So that's why I request our audience, those who are observing our show, it's 100% free. Share our content as much as possible. Share with your government, share with your academy, share with your corporation. It will help us to grow a better ecosystem. Beside that, I want to share a very good news, uh, that World Talent Economy Forum, we are helping India, uh, Italy, as well as Japan to developing a startup village. So already one of the big community, they are collaborating with World Talent Economy Forum. So we need actually people. That's why our speakers, we want to put our board as our advisor, because many of the interesting things happening, we need your guideline. Our people need your support. So those who are our expert panelists, we want to invite you in our board as our advisor, as well as those who are the youth pool, we want to invite you in our board as our ambassadors, because we are engaging with different communities. Just today we finish our deals with this Italian startup village, Indian startup village. It will be happening in Pune, as well as this Japan. We are working very hard, but your guideline, your knowledge will be very helpful for the millions of people. So we want to connect with the real world, not only with the discussion. We want to develop research, coaching, and consulting. And I'm sure those who have any problem, you can communicate World Talent Economy Forums. So if anyone has any problems on climate change related issues, I'm sure Professor Viva will help them, or Mr. James Reed for foundations and other things. We have many expert panelists, so the expert panelists can give you consultation. They can help you to do the research projects, or develop a different kind of projects, or they can train you. So we are developing our organization based on that. Not only this discussion, beside that, we are developing research, coaching, and consulting things. So we need more of your support, especially from our speakers and from our audience actually main strength for our World Talent Economy Forum. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you, Professor Viva, for your continuous support, Mr. James Seed for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Even Professor David Smith, I think he leave early because he has emergency meeting. Thank you for joining today's session. Bye bye and take care.